From studios at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, this is Fourth and State. I'm David Haynes. I'm editorial page editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and we're joined today on a special edition of Fourth and State by Governor Scott Walker. Governor, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for being here. One of the central issues since you've been governor, and certainly in the campaign, is the question of Act 10. Your Democratic challengers have said that they'd repeal it. You've said it works. Why don't you take a minute or two and just sort of briefly explain your position?
Yeah, and then I had a couple local officials who, not necessarily right at the top, but at some point where it's appropriate, can chime in as well, join me as well talking about this, because we started out a week and a half ago. I was with Bob Ziegebauer, who's the Manitowoc County Executive over at Bob's Highway Department, which was actually appropriate because we announced $1 billion worth of savings. We've documented through our website, reforms.wi.gov, reforms.wi.gov. We documented county by county more than $1 billion worth of savings from our reforms at both the state and the local level. And the reason why I say it's appropriate, per your question, Dave, is certainly first and foremost it's the savings we identified, but it's really what we saw in Manitowoc that we see in communities all across the state, whether it's at the Brown Deer School District, where Emily's here, and they've done some fabulous things, whether it's in New Berlin nearby, or whether it's in Northland Pines up in Eagle River, or Waukesha County, where Dan's been able to use these reforms, and plenty of others across the state. It's both savings, which has brought us about for the first time in 12 years, a drop in the property taxes on a median valued home, which is phenomenal when you compare other states going up in property taxes. It's the savings themselves for the taxpayers, but the best part is what it means in terms of empowering both state and local officials to make their governments work better. And that's why the first kickoff was at that highway department, because not only talking to Bob as the county executive, who was a colleague of mine for many years before I became governor, but talking to your team there, they were jazzed up about it. They're pumped up about it. They were actually able to put in place a team that was fully enthused to do great things. And so those are some of the examples. I've given a larger context. To me, the savings are important, particularly in our schools, because I believe it's not pouring more money in, it's being spending it more wisely. And health insurance was a prime example of that. I mean, for years, school districts had to spend tens of millions of dollars more than they needed to because they were essentially, in most school districts, forced to buy their insurance from just one company. That's changed. And so you see school district after school district saving literally tens of millions of dollars from around the state just by bidding out their health insurance. You see others taking advantage of changes in work rules. I remember, and Dan can elaborate this a little bit, but I remember looking back, having been a county executive with Dan as well, in Waukesha County, and the rule was, I think your parks workers, as I recall, got paid from 7:30 to 3:30, and if they worked after that, they got overtime. Well, who uses the parks the most? They use them in the afternoon, early evening. Well, but they were forced to do it on their collective bargain. Even beyond the fiscal impact, and you guys know this story from a few years ago, the story right here at NPS, where you had a brand new, exciting teacher who was named one of the best new teachers of the year for the entire state. 2 weeks later, she gets laid off. And people say, how could that be? How could you possibly, any school district, how do you lay off one of the best new teachers, particularly Milwaukee, NPS, where we want to do even more to improve the school district, and yet she's one of the first ones to be laid off. Why? Well, because under the old collective bargaining system, last hired, first fired. Last in, first out. Well, I don't think for anybody else out there that makes any sort of sense. It certainly doesn't make sense in the private sector. And so what we've done is empower our schools, our counties, our towns, our villages, and our state government as well, particularly when it comes to staffing, to staff based on merit, to pay based on performance. That means in the end we can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms, in our local government positions, and keep them there. And to me, I think that's the biggest long-term benefit of all our reforms. I had one of the superintendents I talked to recently said, the best thing about your reforms is not just he saved money, hired more teachers, set money aside to pay based on merit, lowered classroom size. He said the best thing, though, is I get to go back to my office and focus on curriculum instead of worrying about grievances.
But your opponents have argued that you could have gotten many of those savings without going as far as you did, without some of the aspects of the bill that they've characterized as union busting.
I'd say unequivocally they're 100% wrong. And I think having the guys here can commiserate with me, because I was with Bob and Dan as county executives, but you see at the local level and others as well, there is absolutely no way you can objectively look at it and say, for 72 counties, for 424 school districts, and for more than 1,700 municipalities, there is no way that every one of those jurisdictions would have achieved the same sorts of savings had we not fixed things to the level we fixed them. That you know, when Mary Bell and Marty Beal said they'd take the 5 and the 12, one, that is the most ridiculous of red herrings, because while they were saying it, their own unions were rushing out to ram through contracts like they did in Janesville that came nowhere close to that. So actions speak much louder than words. On top of that, the reality is they can't negotiate for all those jurisdictions. They're all negotiated at the local level, collective bargaining unit by collective bargaining unit. And I saw it firsthand for 8 years, that when I would go through and try to make modest changes, and changes that many times the editorial board thought were reasonable here in Milwaukee, like changes in not just pension health care contributions. Remember, one year we tried to do a 35-hour work week for 4 months, 1 week a month, and the unions basically asked me in particular, told us, forget it, we don't care how many people you lay off. I said the most difficult days I ever had as a county executive were the days when I had to look employees in the face, many of whom came to my office in tears, saying, why can't we do this? Why can't we do this to save my job or to save my coworker's job? And I'd have to tell them, you know, the law is such that you have to go talk to your union steward or your union president. I can't force this to happen. The county board couldn't make it happen. It had to be done through a change in the collective bargaining laws. That's why I think if you were to press most local officials, even those who would consider themselves to be Democrats, even some who maybe raised concerns last year, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anywhere close to a majority of local government officials today who would tell you they would support the full repeal of the reforms we put in place through Act 10, because they know it's worked. Heck, the mayor saved millions of dollars here in the city of Milwaukee. I mean, it has worked all throughout the state, and the reality is long term, the exciting thing, which again I saw firsthand talking to Bob's highway guys, was that they're pumped up, they're jazzed up, they're excited about what they can do. This wasn't just about a pension or health care contribution. Sure, that's part of it, and nobody's thrilled about that. Heck, I mean, it cost me another $10,000, $11,000 per year to my family, because as elected officials, we actually pay a higher percentage of our pension contribution than do state employees. So nobody in my household is particularly thrilled with that either. But if I have to choose between me and others making a contribution versus the massive layoffs you see in other states, I think we're in a much better position, not only in the short term, but long term, we're much, much better off. I mean, the innovation, the reform, I mean, I think about what Brown Deere was able to do with using your savings, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but literally use the savings to make the case to the voters after years of looking at this spring, that they saved enough to actually be able to do a major referendum to improve their schools without raising their tax levy. It's a pretty compelling argument for something that needed to be done, that was years past being done, and you could do it because the reforms worked.
And Governor, I just want to mention one thing. People are forgetting that the unions, the state unions, government workers, were waiting for your election, hoping that Barrett was going to win, because Doyle wouldn't give them what they wanted in their contract. So they thought Barrett will give us what they want. When they got you as the governor, whoops, all of a sudden we were brought to the floor and they were going to try to shove the contracts down our throats. And guess what? Decker said, not going to happen. And that just shows you that there wasn't willingness to roll up sleeves and be a part of the solution. They thought they would try Doyle again, and a lot of people forget about that. It was
right. That was It was after the elections,
right,
but before we took office.
Yes.
And the idea was to push it through the lame duck legislature with the lame duck governor, so it would lock us in to what was in place. Now think about it. And I always say that, you know, David, the other thing to think about, and not just for you as an editorial, but for the electorate, is what are the choices? Because I think sometimes people in Madison in particular live in this vacuum and think it's a yes or a no proposition. Either you do what we did in Act 10 or you don't do anything at all. And we had a $3.6 billion deficit. Like most states across the country, other than a handful that were blessed with abundant natural resources and in energy and natural gas. Everybody else, us, Illinois, you name it, had a deficit. So what do? There's really only 5 options. You can raise taxes. Illinois did that. We saw a year later, after a 67% increase in individual income taxes, 46% increase in business taxes, their budget problem by any measure is worse off today than it was a year ago. So because of that, the next option you have, which they're doing in Illinois, is you can lay off thousands of public employees. Well, their governor's proposing closing 14 state facilities, including a state prison, which will lead to thousands of layoffs like other states did. I said, I don't want to do that either. I mean, the irony is for some of the public employees, unions, for the people they represent, we actually spared the jobs that most other states saw lost en masse. Because I said, I don't want massive layoffs, be it public or private. I believe in smaller government, more efficient government, but you get there through managed reform and attrition. You don't get there through random pink slips. So the third option is you've got Medicaid. You've got Medicaid. Illinois is proposing one of the biggest cuts in American history, more than $1 billion cut in Medicaid. And we knew if you did that, you'd hurt needy families and children and seniors. That's what funds Badger Care and Family Care. I added $1.2 billion to that, the biggest increase of any governor in the history of Wisconsin, one of the biggest increases in the country last year. And the fourth option is you use budget tricks. But you guys have editorialized in the past. The big ones out there, the transportation fund, the patient compensation fund, even forgetting to make the payment and tax reciprocity in Minnesota, those have all been done in the past. That's why we faced the problems we had. We stopped that. We paid those bills. We paid back the injured patient family fund. We paid the money back to Minnesota. We started to restore the transportation fund. We did all those things. So the only other option you're left with is what we did. Long-term structural reforms that helped us not just to balance our state budget, but our local government budgets, not just for now, but for years to come. I mean, to me, it was thinking more about the next generation than just about the next election. And that's the part, the interesting thing from an editorial standpoint. A lot of folks have been in office before like me. It's interesting. You think about it. What I've always thought over the years, whether it was in the assemblies, county exec, now as governor, what's one of the biggest complaints I hear from voters? It's that politicians get into office. Doesn't matter whether it's at local level, state level, federal level. Politicians get into office. Well, the first complaint is they break their promises, which obviously we kept our promises, whether you like them or not, we kept them. But the bigger complaint is people get into these positions and then they fail to have the courage to take on any sort of tough problems. They say that, I hear people, particularly the federal government, they say, it is clear as day that we got a problem here. It's clear as day what the logical options are. But so many politicians, including sometimes some in both political parties, are just scared to death to take those issues on because they're worried about losing. They're worrying about what the next election is going to be like. I said, you may not like every step of every action. You guys have talked about this before. You like some of the results, but you don't like every step we take. And I admit, I've said this before, there are things I do different. I'd spend more time in January or February of last year making the case up front as to what our problem is. If I had said, you know what, people, our schools spend tens of millions of dollars more than they need to because they can't bid out their health insurance. If I said, you know what, overtime is so abusive that in the city of Madison, you got a bus driver that makes $150,000 a year. If I said, in corrections, you've got contracts that allow people to call in sick on their shift and work the next shift right after a time and a half, I think most taxpayers would have said, regardless of party, would have said, Governor, you need to fix that. But I did something unusual in politics. I said, I'm going to fix it, then I explained it. Usually in politics, people talk about it till they're blue in the face, and they never fix it. I should have spent more time talking about it and fixing it, but if I had to choose between fixing it or talking about it, I'm going to pick fixing it every single time.
Can we talk about one of your promises, the one on jobs?
Yeah.
You said you have 250,000 more private sector jobs in Wisconsin at the end of your term. Mm-hmm. According to the last numbers, we've lost more than any other state. Why is that happening? What's happening to your promise?
Yeah, a couple different things. One, just on the promise in total, I still believe we're going to get there by 2015. And the reason I say that is, if you look, interesting analogy for Wisconsin. You look at Wisconsin. When we took over, it was kind of like when Vince Lombardi took over the Green Bay Packers. When Vince took them over, they were 1-10-1. I don't remember because it was before I was born, but from what I've been told, from what the records show, it was 1-10-1. They didn't get to the World Championship the next year. It took them several years, and then they went on for many years thereafter, after they got there, to be world champions. you know, for those who say, including many of my opponents, why aren't there 250,000 jobs? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, you're not going to get there, and you're not even going to get there. You guys have that chart that comes out every month when the job numbers come out. That's fine. I like, you ran the chart when I ran for county executive. You ran them every Sunday in the Crossroads section, and I kept every one of the check boxes I had on there. So if anybody wonders if I'm going to keep them, I have a track record 8 years of keeping my promises in the past. but the couple things in it. One, it's not going to come all at once. Job growth and recovery compounds. It doesn't happen in equal number every month for a 4-year period. It compounds. And why I say there's evidence of that, even today, CEO magazine, which 2 years ago ranked Wisconsin in the bottom 10 of all states in America in terms of places to do business in, last year after our reforms moved us from 41 up to 24. Fastest increase of any state in the country, fastest increase in the history of the CEO survey. This year we jumped up another 4 spots, as announced earlier this morning, to number 20. So we went from a couple years ago 43 to 2 years ago 41, last year 24, and now we're number 20. That's because CEOs here and across America have seen what we've done to turn things around. They like where we're headed. But there's a whole separate section, if you go online and read that story that comes out in print, about the rise of Wisconsin. It talks about there, just like you've seen in plenty of other surveys, the biggest single concern repeated time and time again. I know lawmakers hear it anecdotally, but this is statistically proven, is people are concerned about the recalls. They're fundamentally concerned about the recalls. I don't blame them. If you're a small business and you like what's happened last year, you say, hey, things have turned around, we're heading in the right direction, but they're scared to death when they realize how close this election is, that we might not only go back to the way things were, we might go to the way things are in Illinois right now. And if you're a small business owner, that's why they look at the 8.8% unemployment in Illinois versus 6.8% here and think, that's disastrous. Now, I think you're going to see a fundamental shift. March to March are the numbers you're talking about. Right. Craig Gilbert did a great job of analyzing, as he always does. Very solid, objective number crunch. March, April, May of last year, what happened in the state? Massive uncertainty, right? Okay. Massive uncertainty. I mean, you couldn't look at the Capitol and not think that, right? When things started to quiet down, when they started to ease up, when people started moving on and realizing, you know, in September, when my kids went back to school at a public school, not only did the world, you know, the sky didn't fall. My school, they hired more teachers because they used the reforms. When people saw in December that instead of property tax bills going down, they stayed the same or got better, all these things started to change. And so since the beginning of the year, we've had 15,600 new private sector jobs. We've seen the unemployment rate drop through the first 3 months of this year down to 6.8%. It's the lowest it's been in 2008. As Craig mentioned those numbers, you look at unemployment drop, we're right in there as one of the stronger states in the country in terms of the drop out there. And I think as you see numbers, I think after June 5th, you're seeing a dramatic shift. You're going to see a massive takeoff out there. And it fits in with one other survey. I know I'm overwhelming with data, but I think it's important to back up statements with data, unlike some of the people who complain about me who don't. If you look 2 years ago in the survey done every year by the statewide chamber, the survey showed that just 10% of our employers in 2010 thought we were heading in the right direction. Same survey conducted earlier this year, a couple months ago, number went up to 94%. But on the open-ended questions on what's the biggest thing standing in the way of adding more jobs this year, it was recalls.
Forgive me, maybe I'm wrong on this, but in 2011, didn't job growth go up in the first part of the year and then decline in the last 6 months of the year?
January and February in particular, it went up. Okay. It started to drop again after March, and you start to coincide when not only the protests, but you saw when the recall papers were filed against Alberta and others. You saw a spike during that time frame. You saw after the recalls, there was a pattern of some easing, and it goes up and down. I mean, you had big months in January and February. You had a slight dip in March, although one could argue it wasn't solely because of the city of Milwaukee, but the number in the Milwaukee metropolitan area of jobs lost here was almost exactly equivalent to the number of jobs lost in the state. So is the question, is it a statewide issue or is it a Milwaukee problem? Because since 2004, the unemployment rate's dropped, or the unemployment rate has risen by 29% here in the city of Milwaukee. There's a lot of factors to that. It's not just who the mayor or the council is, but that's part of it. But I think in the end, there's a variety of factors out there. But I think if you talk to employers on just about any measure over there, there's overwhelming evidence and employers like where we're headed, but much of the concern of the past year and heading into the new year about job growth is what's going to happen to these recalls.
In Waukesha in particular, we're seeing some companies that have been acquired by out-of-state interest. SPX, for example, acquired Waukesha Electric. They just announced, and we had the ribbon cutting for a facility, 275 jobs. A couple of weeks ago, we broke ground at Generac. That's another company that was acquired by out-of-state interest, up to 200 jobs. Harkin is ready to cut the ribbon, 25 jobs. And GE acquired the former Waukesha Motor Works, and they're making a commitment there. I think they're going to be bringing jobs. So I know the governor's at Spankry today talking about 30 jobs in Manitowoc. So I think when you start to see outside companies looking at expanding and growing their footprint in Wisconsin, that's especially encouraging.
Oh, and I can tell you why Spankry is increasing their roles too. They're building the Brown Deer
Are they?
Yeah, we're just awarding that contract in a couple of days. I'm sure that's not all the work they're getting, but it certainly is nice to have a piece of it. It's nice to hear that they're expanding. We're very pleased with what they're going to be doing for us, and of course thrilled to be building it all. I stumbled a little on your question because the truth is a little more complex. Yes, my constituents in Brown Deer did pass the referendum. 15 million of it was free, and they knew that, or not free. 15 million of what was giving back the tax decrease that they otherwise would have had. But they were so euphoric with what we were able to afford between that and the federal bonds that they actually passed the second question as well. So I can't say it was a zero levy because the taxpayers, knowing exactly what they were doing, said, we'll take the free and we'll take a little more. And then we sent the work over to Spankry, so everybody wins.
Governor, turning it back to jobs in the city, we have one of the highest black male unemployment rates in the nation. You just announced this week about the 30th Street Corridor project. Some of your opponents say that this is politically driven. Is it?
No, and I think you guys should know as much as anybody because Wayman and Reggie and others were in a week before the announcement meeting with you and walked through the numbers. And I think, again, you appreciate from a content standpoint, you look all the way back to about this time last year, Wayman Winston, who I got to know more than 20 years ago when I worked at the American Red Cross in Milwaukee, and he lived on the west side not too far away from there, was working for WIDA back then, has got a passion for the city, was recruited away to a couple of the spots. I brought him back in. He has a passion for the state, but particularly understands some of the unique challenges we have here in the city of Milwaukee, particularly in some of our most impoverished areas. And we didn't want to do a political statement. If this was the case, we would have done something and just started it a month or so ago, but we started last April. We worked not only with Economic Development Corporation, but particularly with WIDA, with Reggie Newsom, with the Workforce Development, even with Eloise Anderson in terms of the Department of Children and Families, because we knew a lot of these issues were overlapped. And so we charged, first Wayman came to me and said, this is a kind of a dream I have. What do you think about it? And I said, well, you need to do some groundwork. We need to have stakeholders involved. So we had the African American Chamber early on. Along the way, we brought in local chambers, local neighborhood associations. We brought in the Menominee Valley Partners because as we looked at it, we realized it's not just about providing additional assistance to get areas like the 30th Street Industrial Corridor working. You've got to have an incentive. You've got to have a reason for employers to want to come in, particularly industrial employers. So we looked at that corridor. That's why the other day we put the map up where we looked at 30th Street Corridor through the Menominee Valley, particularly with the Menominee Valley Partners, over to the Port of Milwaukee, all the way down to the airport with the Aerotropolis. And we said, you've got an incredible intermodal corridor here that if developed properly, can be a huge advantage. And there's obviously some disadvantages in terms of some of the vacancies and the dilapidated space and other things like that. But there's a great strength in terms of your backbone from an intermodal standpoint. You've got major rail lines for freight rail. You've got 2 interstate highways. You've got major state highways. You've got a pace setter for the Port of Milwaukee that I know well from when I used to chair the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation Board for both commerce within the Great Lakes and across the globe through the Seaway itself. You've got an airport that, even despite Frontier, in the past has been one of the fastest growing airports in the world. You've got, in the Menominee Valley, you've got great excitement and development there. You've got all these things together. And so for us, we said it's not just about, there's been a lot of talk lately about foreclosed homes and that. And a component of this $100 million, leveraging another $100 million plan to transform Milwaukee is a part of that, but it's not enough to just tear down houses. Tearing down houses is not an economic strategy. The problem is not that there's foreclosed homes. The problem is there's not enough jobs in this corridor.
Is this new money, and how many jobs do you expect this to create when, in your vision?
Yeah, we think it is, the $100 million is money through that WIDA has at its disposal. We made a change, the legislature helped us, I signed at the beginning of the month, that allows WIDA to issue tax-exempt bonds for up to $150 million per year for economic development.
So this is new money. This isn't money that's previously been...
It's not been allocated, no, but it's money that's part of that pot. It just hasn't been assigned to things before.
Okay.
But we really felt we needed to deploy resources here for a couple reasons. Not just for Milwaukee itself, but because if Milwaukee succeeds, we succeed as a whole, as a state, for two key components. You succeed economically, and there's been plenty of reports, going all the way back to the 70s that show, years ago, places like Seattle and San Diego and others were about the same size and about the same economic vitality that we have, that we all had back then. And over time, they've grown at a much more rapid pace than Milwaukee, and that as Milwaukee's economic growth slowed down, that had an impact on the state of Wisconsin. So just in a larger economic sense, you have a healthy economy in Wisconsin. In Milwaukee, you have a healthy economy in Wisconsin. Secondarily, it goes to the cost of government Wisconsin, in that if we have more people working and we have a healthier economy here, it's not only the economic vitality, it reduces the impact of the other costs, whether it's social services or other programs the state runs. It makes those resources available for other things, like schools, like our seniors and other components out there. So we think there's an overall value, not just specific to the people of Milwaukee or the people of these neighborhoods, but to the state as a whole.
Number of jobs do you think it could?
Oh, I'm sorry, you asked me about that. The estimate that Wayman and the others gave me as part of the plan design is to the $100 million that they're putting in and the $100 million that consistently has been the track record of WIDA to be able to leverage. They think it's at least 2,000 new construction and other related jobs to that, and there's probably many more multiples beyond that in terms of businesses and others would come in. But just for the growth of using blighted space for industrial space, taking land that had been foreclosed or blighted for multifamily units. Even one of the other sidebars with this is why we involved the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District is when we were working with, and others were working with DRS Technologies, there was some concern in their corridor that several years of flooding would be a deterrent for them to grow and expand in the city of Milwaukee. And so that's where the bioswales came through, and the concept of putting in more components where WIDA could work with the Sewerage District and others to create alternatives to traditional stormwater systems, to put in place more access, particularly in some of the land we recapture from foreclosed upon homes, to not just have vacant space, but to reclaim that for urban agriculture and other things that would help not only provide jobs, but ultimately provide an alternative to some of the stormwater problems we've had in the past. And then the other key component on the positive side being the transportation component.
Governor, keeping the conversation on jobs, but also touching back on the unions that we were talking about earlier.
Wait, there's one other quick question before I cut you up, but just per the last thing I just thought about, sorry, I don't want to lose this train of thought. Per the question about, the comment that we expected the day in terms of is this political or economical, besides the timeline, I mean, this is something that, the city was involved in, the mayor was briefed on, others were out there. It was not specific to the city. I mean, it involves a lot of partners out there. But I mean, I think the groundwork laid with stakeholders speaks for itself. If this was political, we would have ran the screwy to put it together a couple weeks ago. This is an economic project. This is a plan based firmly in economic, not political interest. And it's one that we hope to continue to implement after June 5th. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's it. I'm not talking.
I figured you had notes, so I could go back.
He's done.
That's it.
Hey, your time's up. Sorry, okay.
That's it. I gotta go. No, back to unions and jobs, which seems to be the issue of the day. This last session wasn't the time. You said that you wouldn't pursue right-to-work legislation. You've been pretty clear about that.
Yep.
But some conservative legislators have said they wouldn't mind going down that road. If that came to you, if they produced that legislation, if they could get it through and it got to your desk, how would you react to that?
It's not going to come to my desk. I can tell you plain and simple. And I can tell you why, because you've said some talked about it in the past. They talked about it long before this past year. I don't think there's any real interest from the vast majority of lawmakers, be they Republican or Democrat, of going through in the next session what we went through early this past year. So I just don't, on a personal level, aside from philosophy, I just don't see that happening.
Even with other states like Indiana,
yeah, I mean,
being a right-to-work state.
Yeah, I mean, I think long-term there may be people who come back and reassess it over time. I just don't see there's any aptitude for that in the state of Wisconsin.
But even though they were talking about it a long time ago, I think some of them thought about it as sort of a logical next step.
Well, there's some to talk about, but I think that's such a clear distinction out here. This was never about unions. This is about balancing budgets and putting power back in the hands of the taxpayers. I just had some of the operating engineers in with me today. Private sector unions are overwhelmingly my partner in economic development. In fact, if we'd listened to the private sector unions, we'd be having in place right now further discussions about streamlining the process for safe and environmentally sound mining in the state of Wisconsin, because the operating engineers and the carpenters and others overwhelmingly want to do that and want to work with us to have that happen. They want to put more people to work. If we'd listened to the private sector unions, we'd be lobbying the federal government to pass Keystone, to push through Keystone and push the Administration Act on it, because we're one of the top states in the country that would benefit from that pipeline because of companies like the Micro Corporation. Those private sector unions overwhelmingly are in a position to be our partners in economic development. And I'm not going to have a battle that takes that away from us coming up in the next session as long as I continue to be governor in this term. It's just not going to happen.
So let me change the subject a little bit. One issue that's been hanging over the campaign is the John Doe investigation, headed by the Milwaukee County DA. And one of your challengers, Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, said today, let me get the quote right, "It's time for Walker to come clean about whether he is a target of the investigation or not." So are you? And if not, why do you need that recent transfer of the 60,000 into a special fund to pay for criminal defense?
Well, Tom Barrett's a lawyer, so he probably knows better than I what the legal requirements are. But the bottom line is that my office, when I was county executive, for my instruction, my chief of staff asked John Chisholm to look into the original issue. That opened the door to other things along the way. And the bottom line is we've cooperated all throughout the way, but there's a lot of documents to look at. And I don't think the taxpayers of this state want a governor to be looking at thousands and thousands of documents when I should be focused on jobs, which is exactly what I've been doing. In terms of specifics, as I've said repeatedly, and just said to Mike Goucher the other day on a show, and said to your obviously reporters plenty of times before, because we're in a position to be helpful to John, he's asked us not to comment. He and his team have asked us not to comment on specifics, and so I'm going to honor that, because even though I'm not a lawyer, I understand enough to at least to listen to that particular lawyer.
Do you see anything political in the length of the investigation? People talk about it's taking so long, etc.
No, I mean, I can't speak for everyone in that office, and I think there are, questions have been raised about that, but I've worked with John before. I know John. I've always viewed him to be a straight shooter. And my guess is the time is because he's trying to make sure he does this as balanced as possible.
Have you had a meeting with Chisholm?
Are you concerned about the criticism that's been coming?
Oh, I mean, sure. I mean, to me, it's like fighting a fight with both hands tied behind your back. But because I've listened to what John's asked me to do, I either honor that or I go on.
No, I meant the criticism of him. The way he's conducted.
Oh, no. But in your point about, that's why I mean, sure, there's a lot of things I'd love to run out and say. The only other thing I've said beyond this, that goes beyond specifics, is to say I think that the record's pretty clear that anytime I found something to be wrong in my office when I was the county executive in particular, I acted on it within hours of first coming up. So I think if people will have any question about that, I can't get into the other specifics because of what he's asked. But the record's pretty clear. You guys were the ones that pointed out to us. When we found out about something that was problematic in terms of ethics, we acted on it right away. But I'm sorry.
So going back to your point
John,
with John, are you concerned about the criticism? What about the criticism that he's taking?
Well, I point out, repeat it. I've said it. I'm not just saying it to you here. I've said it on TV shows and radio shows when others have asked. I said I have had no reason to believe from him personally that there's anything other than him trying to seek the truth. Now, again, I can't speak for everyone else, and a lot of things I hear about this are things I don't know what the source is, and so I can't speak to that. But the action I've had with him has always been straightforward.
Thank you.
Governor, lots of people think, let me back up. You surprised a lot of people when you rolled out Act 10, and you've talked a little earlier about how you might have done a better sales job beforehand. Let's say you're reelected next month. What's your agenda going forward? Do Do you have any surprises you'd like to tell us about?
I'm going to announce all 250,000 jobs on June 7th.
Well, you want to do that June 4th?
Yeah, that would be nice. Actually, see, now, that would be the right timing, because the day before Alberta's, the city of Milwaukee came out and confirmed that the city actually netted money out of Act 10 as opposed to losing money. So you're right, that would be a good time to do that. But no, I mean, for us, you're going to hear, I used to say I sound like a broken record, but my teenage sons remind me that nobody knows what a record is anymore. So I guess I sound like a repeating iPod or a scratch CD or something like that.
Yeah. You're right.
Even the CDs are fast. It's iPad. But no, I mean, for us, it's the same things. I think our focus will overwhelmingly be on helping the people, not the government. The people of the state create 250,000 jobs. To create more jobs, to create more opportunity, that means more freedom and prosperity. Focus on that. And to me, the things I'm going to talk about after the election as governor are the same things I talked about as county executive running for governor, and the same things I talked about the last 15 months. To me, it's a real simple recipe. It's 6 things you got to do, 3 of which are things that are attractive, 3 are things that are must-haves. The 3 things that make you more attractive are making for a more reasonable and fair tax burden in the state, particularly for small businesses, which are overwhelmingly driven by individual income taxes. So I think relief you can provide there along with property tax relief is key. We provided it. We'll continue to provide it. It's easing the regulatory climate, so we streamline things in a way that what we enforce is about common sense, not about bureaucratic red tape, which still means public health and public safety, but doing it in a way that's science-based and predictable. It means reining in the out-of-control, frivolous lawsuit climate that we have on small businesses and family farmers, and continue to put that in check. Those are the 3 good things that we're going to continue to push, so that next year, hopefully, we broke the top 20. I'd like to be in the top 10 by the time I'm done, and I'd like to be fighting for the top in a couple of years for the best state to do business in, to create jobs in. The 3 must-haves, you've got to have a pipeline of skilled workers. You've got to address the workforce issue. It's why you guys have heard Tim Sullivan come in on my behalf talking about trying to redeploy resources and aggressively put in place a system that it's not just about putting more dollars, but doing even more marketing to get young people in to the jobs and the training we need for the jobs that are available today, like high-skilled welders, like machinists. I mean, heck, Monarch Corporation, I visited a number of times now, they'd hire a 3rd shift if they could get enough. And it's not because we have a lack of courses available in our technical colleges, if we don't have enough bodies in those classes. So we need to do more than that. That's why I asked him to come on, why I was so thrilled he was coming on, because it crosses over from technical colleges, higher education, public education, workforce development. All those things are things that Tim has talked to you about in editorial board interviews. We'll keep pushing on. So it's skilled workforce, must have. It's cost-effective and reliable sources of power, which means not taking anything off the table, having as many different sources as possible, and plugging that in to power our system of creating jobs. And the final thing is you got to have an infrastructure system, particularly driven by transportation, that's intermodal. That's highways, roads, bridges, freight rail, ports, airports. All the things we've talked about are advantages in the Transform Milwaukee proposal we have, but are issues that we're trying to correct all across the state. Those are the things we're going to focus in on. Those are things we're going to get done. And we're going to continue to do it in a way that makes sure we don't spend money we don't have.
Does intermodal include transit, mass transit buses?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'd love long term. I'm happy to see that Chris has been able to do more with bus rapid transit, some of those concepts. Here are some of the things I've fighted for years. And sometimes it just takes a different person to have a little more willingness.
I got a question about the election. You've raised a fair amount of cash since January, at least.
A little bit.
A little bit. But the new Marquette poll out today shows you're in a dead heat. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Why do you think what's happening there?
Well, the reason I had to raise money, I mean, remember, I wouldn't have to raise or spend a penny if it weren't for the out-of-state special interests who drove this. They drove the protests last year. They played a key role in that. They drove the battle in the Supreme Court. They certainly, as Alberta knows, drove the money in the recalls against 6 Republican senators. They were actively involved in the recall itself, and they've been involved in driving the campaign thus far, both in money documented and other money that comes in other ways that's harder to document. We believed all along the out-of-state special interest money would be driving this election, and you see it in all that they're doing. You see it in each of the candidates. Instead of a primary where they're pitted against each other, they're pitted against us. Mm-hmm. I think you see, much as you saw in 2000 and 2004 in this state, Politically, you've got a very evenly divided state, Republican and Democrat. This is not a new phenomenon. Again, Craig Gilbert did a good job of running the numbers. This is, anytime you've got a tight race, this is the way the things are going to be. And so we expected all along a tight race. You know, for all the talk about the numbers yesterday, the reality is we need it to offset the overwhelming amount of money that's come into the past year and will continue to come into Wisconsin. And the interesting thing is, you know, per the money that came in, two things. One, 76.4% of my donations are still from people who gave me $50 or less. And there obviously were others, including some from outside of Wisconsin, that were bigger than that. But you look at the vast majority of those. I mean, look at, one of my big donors from Houston, a good example. He doesn't do anything in Wisconsin. And the interesting thing is some people say, well, that's, you know, my opponents tried to make that into a negative. But you guys for years have questioned, what do people want in return for their donation? This guy has nothing. There's nothing possibly he could benefit from Wisconsin. He doesn't do business here. There's no legislation before us. The only thing he cares about is he watched TV and he saw all the pounding we got from out-of-state special interest. He said, I want to do something about that. Now, in contrast, does anybody believe for a minute that all the big government union money that's coming from Washington doesn't come with the expectation of something in return? They know it. They want it. They're putting this money in because they believe if somebody new wins that they're supporting, that they'll put the power back in the hands of the union leaders instead of us putting the power back in the hands of the taxpayers. That's what it's all about. So in terms of following the money, I'd say, you know, the bigger question is, what is the other side doing in return for that investment? Our investment is putting the power firmly back in the hands of the taxpayers. That's what this is all about.
Break down in terms of out-of-state, in-state.
What's that?
How does your money break down out-of-state?
I knew the number, the total number, and I didn't do the breakdown. Other than I always ask how much is $50 or less. Okay. But it's a sizable amount. There's no doubt about it. But I mean, you have people all across the country who are watching this because you see, when we prevail, God willing, with the help of the voters on June 5th, when we prevail in this state, this will send a powerful message, not just in Madison. It'll send a message in Springfield, in St. Paul, in Columbus, in Austin, in Albany, and in particular in Washington. It'll send a message not just to Republican governors. It'll send a message to people like Andrew Cuomo in New York State or Deval Patrick in Massachusetts who signed collective bargaining reform for local governments over health insurance. It'll send a message to the Democrat state treasurer in Rhode Island. Heck, it'll send a message to Rahm Emanuel in Chicago who's taking on the public teachers union in that city, trying to shake things up on the interest of the taxpayers and the students and families. In every one of those cases, they're going to look at Wisconsin. And not just Republicans, but discerning Democrats who are governors and mayors are going to say, you know what? If I win, they're going to say, you know, it's worth sticking your neck out to make tough decisions. Conversely, if somehow we lose, which is obviously possible in a 50-50 race, I think it sets aside any sort of courage, Republican or Democrat alike, in American politics at least a decade.
And you couldn't have done this without out-of-state money yourself. You couldn't have done this with money just from Wisconsin to fight back.
Oh, well, I mean, did the mayor bring in Rahm Emanuel just to get in-state money? No, he brought a politician in from Illinois. I mean, that's not unique. We asked for help from all over. I didn't put a limit on how much. I asked for as much help as I get because I knew I was under attack. And I didn't put a limit on it. To me, I think campaign contributions, the more transparent, the more wide open things are, every bit of, down to my last little penny, every bit of my contributions are fully disclosed. Unlike the other side, where their money passed through that ends up in the Greater Wisconsin Committee that came from this union, going to that union, going to this union, to that union, all of whom have the same expectation. That whether it's Tom Barrett saying he's going to call a special session, and when he says, for a guy who says he's going to end the Civil War, it's interesting rhetoric. When asked how he's going to do that, he says he's going to get in the ring, and he's going to fight, and he's going to punch, and he's going to target any of the members of the Assembly, and he's going to take them out if they don't pass the reforms he wanted to have passed. And so for anybody who's scared, who didn't like the process that was used last year, basically both Falk and Barrett have said they're going to repeat it again just in reverse. They're going to go through and rehash the same debate we had in Wisconsin over the past year. They will have, the only difference is, it might take more than a year because the Assembly still will have Republican control, and so it probably will last several years. So for anyone who says, you know what, I'm an independent voter, I didn't like everything the governor did the last year, I kind of liked the results, but I didn't like the process, why in the world would you vote for someone who's going to rehash that same debate for a year or more into the future?
So go back and talk, you talked eloquently before about how you might have handled things different the first couple of months. If you'd handled them how you had talked about that, do you think we'd be having a recall?
Yes, I do.
You don't think it would have won over and people would have understood?
No, I think there would have been an attempt for recall. I don't know whether it would have been successful. You certainly wouldn't have maybe the kind of national attention that you had first in the protest. Because you had legitimately plenty of people from Wisconsin, but you had people brought in. Yeah, I think that all escalated because of the timing and a number of other factors. I still think based upon what we did, yeah, you'd have people that would have pushed back on it. Whether or not it would have gotten to a recall that was actually an election and whether or not it would be this close, I don't know. But again, I go back to for 8 years, having seen it firsthand as a county executive, see just how difficult it was, and knowing if you're not going to pick those other poor choices, the higher taxes, the massive layoffs, the Medicaid cuts, or the budget tricks, the only other way to balance the budget is to rein in aid to local governments. Almost 50% of the state budget is aid that goes back to schools. Almost 60% is aid for all local governments. If you don't reduce that, you have to go to one of those other poor options. Well, having been a local official for all that time, I knew the only way to make that workable would be to ultimately give local governments those tools, and you have to give them across the board. Because I can't say to Bob, well, you know what, I hope you can work it out, because I know Dan's going to work it out, but I hope Bob can work it out in Manitowoc County, because then you'd have this patchwork of some that benefited and some that didn't if we based it all on keeping collective bargaining in place. You had to change it. The other interesting question, I think, and you guys did a nice job, or your not the editorial, but the paper did a nice job of asking this question. I don't remember if it was Marley or who asked it a month or so ago, but they pointed out that neither Kathleen Falk nor Tom Barrett can tell you what they do to balance the budget.
Well, that's the issue.
Right. Remember that even though the ads talk about money for businesses, Mike Ellis put out a great release today. He pointed out that, what is it, 217 million of the 3.6 billion was attributable to tax cuts. And even some of them are things like, it wasn't to a corporation, there are even things included in that are like repealing the state tax and health savings accounts. So if you're a sole proprietor, if you're a dentist, you're a realtor, you're a farmer, all those things benefit. So it's not just big corporations. And for some of the handful of others, it was manufacturers and agricultural-based industries. But in this budget, it's only about $200 million. So when people ask, how would you balance the budget, the only thing that Falk and Barrett say is, well, we repeal the tax breaks for businesses. Despite the fact that they were put in place to help create jobs, you can see that for a second to say, well, whether they did or they did, okay, let's do that. Where's the other $3.4 billion come from? And I think that's even more important than ever, because this isn't an election for an open seat. This isn't what Tom and I went through 2 years ago. The whole basis for the argument for this recall, as you just talked about, is to undo what was done over the last year. If you're undoing something, don't you owe it as an obligation of explaining that you want to undo? It's clearly told people they want to undo collective bargaining and go back to the way it was. Well, then, isn't the obligation in turn to say what you would do to make up the difference? Because I think it's pretty clear. There either is no plan, or the plan is what we see on display in Illinois right now. Massive taxes, massive layoffs, massive cuts in things like Medicaid.
I think it's important to realize the historical perspective for those of us that had the opportunity to serve in the legislature for many years. I came in with then Representative Ziegelbauer, in fact, in 1990, and I had the opportunity for 15 years to sit on the Labor Committee and chair that committee for several of those years. And there were numerous attempts, bills introduced. We had task forces on the mediation arbitration law, collective bargaining changes, and even minor changes to the collective bargaining law that were proposed were just summarily dismissed because the public employee unions disdained for any changes. I remember Senator Darling and I, in fact, put in the state budget one year a provision that would have taken health insurance off of the bargaining table, either make it a prohibited subject and certainly not a mandatory subject of collective bargaining. We passed it and that was vetoed. We put a bill in the legislature, I remember under John Gard's leadership as Speaker, that for the first time asked state employees who were paying absolutely no co-pay monthly toward their health insurance, a great plan, a $5 plan for singles and $20 a family. They marched on John Gard's home in Peshtigo. They stormed the Capitol for a $5 and a $20 copay. So there have been numerous attempts to try to make negotiated changes to the mediation, arbitration, collective bargaining laws, and they went without any kind of success. So,
and think about it with just one addendum on that, Dan. Dan's exactly right. Think about that again here locally in Milwaukee. And this is to show you I'm not just picking on union leadership. The Milwaukee Public School System and the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association finally, after a lot of time and a lot of reality checks, realized earlier this year that they had a big problem with MPS. And so they came to the legislature and me and said, you know what, that window, 90 days that everybody had before, for the handful of historic contracts, as you guys know, could you get us included in it? I remember at the time, before I went out and talked to reporters about this, there were some people who said, oh, you could have some hay with this and say I told you so, and we're not going to change it because I'm just going to prove my point. But that wouldn't have been good for the most importantly, not just the taxpayers in Milwaukee, but for the students in our schools. So we went and worked together and passed in an overwhelmingly bipartisan way. And ironically, even after the teachers union leadership stepped up, because of all this pent-up frustration, I think a lot of it driven by the recall, by some of the rhetoric you hear in the recalls, they opted not to approve that. Well, that's unfortunate, because now they're going to have to wait a year. Hopefully maybe they'll give it another shot, but wait a year to put in place some real reforms that'll help them keep teachers in the classroom, keep reforming things. And then, in a year, obviously, they'll go beyond just those sort of adjustments to doing the things that I think are the most exciting part. Aren't just the cost savings, it's the things that, again, Bob and I were talking about Mantalk, but we see it. We had a school board member from Fond du Lac with us the other day, the former president of the school board, and it's exciting to see the sorts of changes they're making that really are dynamic.
It's been transformational, and those who just follow the dollars of the health insurance and the retirement contributions are missing the story. It's so much more than that. It's the ability to manage. It's the ability to modernize organizations that for 35 years have been frozen in place because of the inflexibility of what really was a one-sided mediation arbitration system. Anybody who's worked in it understands that. It's just a fundamental fact. There's no ambiguity about that at all. And what that did is the status quo just stifled the ability of local government to get with it. Our highway department, we're just small potatoes. We're a 15th of the size of Milwaukee County or something like that. But we were the center of union-focused turmoil 2.5 years ago. Today we're like the Marines. We're ready to fight, and our guys love their job. And as I was telling the governor on Monday, I guess it was, I had one of my longtime members who never lost or was in danger of losing his job because of seniority take a day of vacation the day you came. We had a number of people expressing their opinion on the contrary side of life. He took a day of vacation to stand out with a sign outside supportive of the governor. When I heard that, I was kind of touched by that. But it probably didn't need to go that far, but it was an anecdotal way of seeing how we've changed in our little shop, 45 employees into a bunch of happy people going out there to work. Once you get by the modest realignment of the personnel costs and get into the modernizing and the updating of the operation, the day-to-day operation, you can do great things. And we're all going to be doing that.
The day after the bill was passed and signed into law, I had a meeting like this around a table like this with my cabinet, and I told them that what I wanted them to do was treat our people fairly and equitably and in such a manner that they would look back 5 years from now and say, why did we even have a union? we've been working our highway crews 4 10-hour shifts instead of 5-hour days. We've had tremendous amount of flexibility. We don't have to promote just on longevity. We've got the ability to cross-train people. Our people are, I think, really enjoying the flexibility, and it's just been tremendous in terms of mentoring new employees. We were one of the first counties to have a pay-for-performance system, and now we're looking at expanding that to the rest of our staff. And what this does is allow people to really grow. This allows them to get the kind of experience they need and do special projects and get promotions based on performance and based on the type of training that they attain. So I've seen a lot of our people really react favorably in Waukesha County, and they're happy people. I had a person retire last week, and I asked her husband, "Is there anything you want me to say?" And he said, "Well, just that when I waited every day to pick her up, I saw a lot of happy people coming out of the courthouse." And I think that's because when you treat people, whether they're public employees or anyone, with respect and dignity, and you're fair, and they understand why they're getting promoted, it was to the point where people would drive a certain truck because they'd been there longer. Some of these nuances of the collective bargaining, I almost like to call them collective arguing laws. They were not promoting workplace harmony, frankly. And we've had tremendous success, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work in this area. And not only in the area of health insurance, we've been able to do some tremendous things with wellness. We all know that the key to controlling healthcare in our country is to make sure people don't get sick. And so some of the initiatives we're putting out in healthcare, like you with the health savings accounts, it's phenomenal. We've got over 1/3 of our people, and we're one of Waukesha County's largest employers with almost 1,400 full-time people, which is, we've been able to reduce that. But we've got people taking all kinds of wellness initiatives that are keeping our healthcare costs down. So I think the future, people that are holding on to the past are not helping our state move forward. And what the governor and legislature did was something that had to be done. It was a long time in coming. There were many efforts to try to make meaningful changes. It wasn't occurring, and I'm very pleased that those of you that are in the legislature took that tough vote, and Governor, your leadership on it has really been phenomenal. I believe, just like the workers of the state, the people of this state are going to turn around 5 years from now and say, it was the best thing we ever did.
Governor, just to get back to the recalls for a minute, 2 questions. One is, this will be by far the most expensive governor's race in history. What's the effect of all that money in state politics? And second, is there a permanent change in state politics as a result of sort of the recall era we've been in?
I think on the latter question, it depends on the outcome. I think if somebody other than me is elected on June 5th, it will fundamentally change elections in Wisconsin, and it'll fundamentally change recalls. Because I think you'll have a recall the year after, and you have a recall the year after, and you have a recall the year after. I think if people don't like recalls, the last thing you want to do is vote to recall me, the lieutenant governor, or any of the senators. Because I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that if a year from now, if collective bargaining is back, taxes go up through the roof, or whatever it takes to balance the budget, that there won't be, because as I mentioned, long before I was governor, this state's been just about equally divided on politics. There'll be another group on the other side, it'll be like a ping pong. It'll be a recall ping pong. And it'll go back and forth, and I think that's bad not just for election. I think it's bad for jobs. I think employers will be scared to death of that. You'll see instead of not only job growth, I think you'll see retraction as employers go somewhere else. I think that's a horrendous outcome. I think the best way for us to move forward is not just, and sound self-serving, but I do think, set me aside, I think for each of the people on the ballot June 5th to win, that's the best way to move the state forward, not only on policy, but in terms of these elections. And then take it a step further and say, having learned some of the questions about what would you do differently, I mean, I think if you look at education reform, you guys have covered it, talked about it, even editorialized it, which I appreciate. But most voters don't know much about any of the education reform we've done besides Act 10. Why? Because Dr. Tony Evers and I started out on it last March on the reading initiative, and then we worked on educator effectiveness, and then we worked on school and school district accountability, and we brought people together on it. We brought stakeholders to the table, and we didn't punch each other in the nose, and we didn't call each other names, and we didn't have a big fight. Well, that's how we've gotten things done. So I think in terms of track record, people say, how are things going to change? You get past June 5th, I think many of the people on either side of the issue that have come in from other states move on to Ohio or Florida or wherever else they're going to go. We get back to business here. And I think after that recall, I think you probably, the voters of this state, I think, will demand from all, both Republicans and Democrats in the legislature, that there permanent changes be made to the recall laws in the state and in the Constitution, so that you have recalls for really big issues like misconduct in office or something like that. But, you know, I'm not here to debate. The law is what it is, and so we're having an election, and I'm not going to cry over spilt milk over that. But I think long-term people want to change it. I think on the dollar part, I think because it's become such a national issue when all the interest groups came in and then others tried to counter it and balance it out, that's why the size of the money so big. I don't think you'll ever see anything close to this in Wisconsin again. I don't think it's suddenly escalated. I think it'll go back.
I think County Executive Cruiser, one of our colleagues, Democrat on the Democratic side of the aisle in the Capitol for many years now, County Executive Kenosha said it best. I was on a panel with County Executive Cruiser, and he said recalls should be for just cause, not for just cause. And I think this one is for just cause.
Well, I think
we got time for about a couple more minutes, about 5 minutes.
I just want to say one thing. The elections in 10 really were substantially profound, flipping the assembly significantly, and Michelle came in with a group of people who had pounded the pavement and came in with an agenda. And in the Senate too, we had a significant majority. And I think that what people are concerned about is how can you have a major election and have people who are elected to do what they said they're going to do, and then you have what we have now. To me, that creates constant chaos, and that's not what people in our state want. They might not want exactly what happened. They might disagree about how it happened and some of the particulars. I understand that, but are we going to just say, okay, we're going to keep recalling? Because after I won my election, the Democratic Party said, our goal is to take the Senate. We're going to have another round of recalls. I don't think that's a good way to do public policy for Wisconsin. I really don't. I think it's very, very damaging.
So you support if recalls continue, whatever party's in power?
No, I don't. I think that there has to be a reform of recalls, but I think elections have to be respected. That we had an election in 10, a huge minority came in with a mission, and they came in revved up because they were new people, first timers, and they wanted to do what they said.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm asking. So if there's a recall, a Republican trying to recall a Democrat, you'd stick with the Democrat to stop the recall.
Well, a good example on that one actually is after the vote that failed to pass in the Senate on mining. You had some people talking about both recalls against Dale Schultz and against Bob Jouk. They asked me what I thought. I said, I don't think that's a good idea.
And I said the same thing.
I said, I don't necessarily agree with them, and I'm hoping some way I can work with them to balance it out. But my solution to passing that bill isn't to go support a recall. It's to work with them or work with whoever's in the Senate at some point in the future, not to constantly go through these recalls. Because I agree, I don't think they're healthy.
But if you win June 5th, there are still going to be a lot of angry people in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. How do you end the Civil War, not to borrow a phrase, How do you do that?
Well, again, I go back, I think the education example is the best one out there, and it can apply to other things. You look at the process we used, you look at the amount of time we laid the groundwork, or even, for example, what we were asking about before, the Transform Milwaukee as a more parochial example. These aren't things we just ran through. These are ideas we worked on for some time. We worked together. We brought people in, brought stakeholders on. But we didn't use that as an excuse for inaction either. Because that, to me, was part of the reason why we acted so urgently is too often in the past, people talked but didn't act. They didn't fix things. I still want to fix things, but I understand, particularly considering what we've gone through the last 15 months, that there needs to be added extra special attention to the process as well as to the product. And as long as the process doesn't preclude you from getting to a product that fixes things, we're going to continue down the path of improving the process. And I think that more than anything. Yep.
I wonder if I could take a swing at part of that answer too, because I don't think the answer to the end of the Civil War, if there is one, is all up to the governor. I think that's up to those of us in local government, because when the law went into effect June 30th at midnight, my board met the next morning at 7 a.m. to pass policies for the entire set of teachers so they know exactly where they stood. And they convened that morning at 7 a.m. They convened 2 task forces for every staff member instead of just the bargaining team. Every single professional staff member was invited to participate in discussion of salary and retirement benefits that morning at 7 a.m. so that there would be no waking hour that they would be wondering if we were going to include them. And for all of Brown Deer, through all of this year, we have been collaborative every step of the way. We've been able to do shared governance that we haven't been able to do in this state since 1970. I'm a school board member before being a business officer. I know we tried. The union said, don't even ask our people to come. We won't let them come. Now they can come, and they do come. I have 16 people talking about retirement benefits, all the math staff, all the people who can do that, all came. I have 40 people came to talk about the employee staff handbook. That just says to me that there's a hunger in the staff to be part of their own fate and not just to leave it to several spokespeople. They love the fact that they can collaborate. They all call the superintendent me by our first names. It's like being Cher. And they all write to us all the time. All the time. Emily, what's my retirement benefit? Emily, what do I don't mind that. It's a little district. That's what it means to be from Wisconsin. All our districts, almost all our districts are little. And so why can't we talk to everybody? Well, in the old days we couldn't. Really, it's way more than the money. The fact that we can collaborate, I honestly wonder if 2 years from now, if you ask the teachers whether they would go back, I wonder if they'll even say, in fact, I'm sure some of them already would say, we won't go back because it wasn't even 2 months past the passing of the law before I had a teacher in my office saying, you know, you need me, and I want a raise. And we said, okay, you get it. We do need you. He's not going to go back. He knows we need him, and he knows he could not have done that under the old rules. So our entrepreneurial educators are going to be right in there saying, I don't need a union, I can do this. And all the people that are just sort of warm, wonderful, nurturing teachers for our children that don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about it, they're going to come in for the issues they do care about, whether it's reading or salary or OPEB, which is everybody's least favorite issue, including mine. But it has to be done, and they all showed up. I just love collaborating. I care about it even more than the money, even though I'm responsible for the money.
And that's we have unleashed transformational change, and that isn't an exaggeration. Yeah. 5 years from now, when we look back, there will be scores of things and stories like this that we won't even have thought were possible.
I agree.
That's what I mean. Somebody asked me, a friend, an ally, asked me last December. It wasn't a negative question. It was just being insightful. He said to me, he said, Scott, do you ever think if you hadn't gone so far, would you not be facing a recall? Yeah, just a pretty inquisitive question. And I thought for a minute, and I said, well, you know what? For exactly what you guys were just talking about. I said, if I hadn't done what we did, we wouldn't have fixed it. I said, now, as you see, the next 4.5 weeks, I'm going to run an election to win. I'm working hard to win. I'm making my case around the state. But I'm not afraid to lose. And the reason I say that is because 5 years from now, much more important than whether my name is on the outside of the governor's office, is that local governments and people across the state can look back and say, you know what? We didn't just fix things, we made them better. We empowered our local, not just our local government leaders, but the good, decent, hardworking people that work in our schools and our cities and our towns and our villages and our state and our counties can now do the things that most of them got to do in the first place. Most educators I know, including the ones that teach my kids at Wauwatosa East High School, love kids. They want to inspire kids. They want to make kids' life better. And most people I know who work in the public sector really were motivated by whatever agency or program they're a part of, and that's what they love doing. This empowers them to be able to do that. So in the short term, it doesn't quite, although I think every day that goes by, I hear stories like that from employees all across the state, many of whom say to me, at first I was kind of scared, but this is working out great. This is awesome. And I think for the population as a whole, I honestly believe when we get past June 5th, the ads go away, at least the ads for the state. I guess it won't be long after the presidential ads come back to Wisconsin, but the ads go away, the attacks go away, the people from all sides of the spectrum move on to other states or other issues out there. I remember I've held all throughout this past year, crazy as it might seem, I've held listening sessions after I read at elementary schools with teachers where I go and meet for an hour with teachers. And Some schools like Franklin Elementary in Wausau spent the time actually sitting down and talking about education policy, which is why when I signed the education reform bill, I did it there because I wanted to show it came full circle. We listened to what they said, we made some changes, we incorporated in the bill. But others, as you can imagine, were just literally a complaint session. And usually about second or third question was, why are you attacking teachers? And I'd say, with all due respect, so you may not like all that I've done, you may not like paying more for pension or health care, heck, I don't particularly like it. I said, but if you look on YouTube over the last year, just about everything I say, including sometimes when I order food at Culver's or McDonald's, is somewhere on YouTube. And I said, in all that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a YouTube clip of me talking about teachers saying anything but praise. Praise for the ones that teach my kids and have looked out for my kids over the past year, even though it would have been easy to dump on them. Praise for the ones that are good friends of Tonette and I who teach in schools all throughout this year. Praise for teachers I don't even know. I said the irony is, who's told you you've been under attack? Your union. Your union leadership, for to me at least, largely political purposes, to gin you up, to get you motivated, to get you involved in trying to be winning these recalls. Once we get past that and the elections are done, it's time to move forward. Will that automatically end everything? No. I'm not naive to think that. But I do think that will be a major step towards bringing our state together. And then I think the next question, or the next step in that building block, is then the process and the product I just talked about. Making sure we're not just focused on the product, but making sure we have a strong process that incorporates people, that listens to people, that brings them into the process, that still gets things done in the end.
Well, Governor, thanks a lot. We should wrap up. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you very much.